Hey you guys, today we're gonna make scones. In this video, I'm gonna give you a quick overview on just some basic measuring and mixing and show you a couple kitchen tools that we're gonna be using and show you how to turn on your oven and talk about kitchen times and things like that. So first thing I'm gonna do is preheat the oven to 450. So I did that and it's getting started. Okay, and then you can see I've got my ingredients out all in order, and I've got the measuring utensils that I'm going to use right in front of the ingredients as well. Okay, so bear with me a minute while I get things set for you to see for the measuring. Okay, so I'm going to start with my flour, as you can see on the recipe, and there's a very specific way that I like you to measure flour. I like you to use a spoon and scoop the flour into the measuring cup. That just makes it so that you don't get too much flour. If you take the measuring cup and scoop right down into the flour container, you usually end up packing the flour down and it gets a little too much. Okay, and then what I like to do is take the back of a butter knife and just level it off, and then it goes in the mixing bowl. So that was 1 cup, and then the next amount is a 1/2 cup. So same thing, scooping in. I like to overfill it just a little bit and then level it off with the back of a butter knife. Okay, so that's our flour, 1.5 cups flour, which is gonna act as the structure for the recipe. All right, and I do like to move ingredients out of the way when I'm done with them. All right, the second dry ingredient is baking powder. Baking powder is called a leavening agent, and it actually helps make these scones rise from flat into kind of like puffed up a little bit. And the baking powder has a built-in leveler, which is nice. So it's 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder. And then not to be mixed up with baking powder is baking soda. Okay, most recipes don't require to use both baking powder and baking soda, but this particular one does. Oh, wrong side, there you go. Baking soda. And this one is just a 1/2 teaspoon of baking soda. So you want to double check those measurements of baking powder and baking soda and make sure you don't get those two mixed up. Okay, because 1.5 teaspoons of baking soda in this recipe would taste really bad. All right, next up is sugar. These are scones, which is basically like a sweet biscuit. And it's 1 tablespoon of sugar. You can go ahead and scoop the sugar. And then what I like to do is again take the back of that butter knife and just level off any extras, and that goes in with the dry ingredients. And the last ingredient is salt. Sorry, not the last ingredient, the last dry ingredient is salt. I usually like to measure salt over something because I don't have a very steady hand. So I usually always end up over pouring and then again taking the back of the knife to level off. Okay. So that concludes our dry ingredients. So now I'm just going to mix those together with a wooden spoon. You can use whatever you have. You can use like a large serving spoon. You can use a fork. I just like how a wooden spoon works. Okay. So make sure those are all mixed together before you add your shortening, because if you add your shortening when those things are separated out into clumps, the shortening is going to make those things stick in one spot, and then you're going to get a large bite of just salt or a large bite of just baking powder or just baking soda. All right, we measure shortening just like the other ingredients that we just measured by scooping it in, but with this we want to make sure we use the back of the spoon to pack down the shortening into the cup just to get rid of any air and negative space. Okay, so back of the spoon packs the shortening down to completely form into the cup. And then just like the other things, we're going to overfill slightly and then just scrape to level off at the top. Okay, and you can use the back of the spoon for that. All right, so then we're gonna put that shortening in with the dry ingredients. The shortening is really sticky, sticks everywhere. So when you're washing this stuff, you have to have really hot soapy water, otherwise it just will not come off. I actually like to wipe down my knives and my spoons and my measuring cup before I put it in the water. Okay, so I'm just gonna scrape all the excess out of there and get it down into the dry ingredients. And then I'm going to use my pastry blender to mix those things together. So this is a pastry blender. If you don't have a pastry blender, you can use a fork. It's just a little bit more cumbersome. A pastry blender has tines that are wider apart. And so basically what it does is it pushes and cuts the shortening into the flour. And what that does is make it so that it's not a tough biscuit, it's like a soft biscuit, okay? So shortening is fat, it's vegetable fat. You could use butter if you wanted to, but shortening, I like it because it doesn't have like a real strong flavor. So if you're adding something like chocolate chips, raspberries, things like that, then the shortening is not going to get in the way of the flavor of those things. So you're just kind of chopping down the shortening into the dry mixture until it all kind of looks like, you know, small crumbs. And I'll show you with my hands in just a minute what it's going to end up looking like when it's all said and done. Okay, so kind of get all the rest of that shortening out. Pick it up, let it run through your fingers. If you don't notice any large chunks of shortening, then you're good. All right, now we're gonna add our chocolate chips. Now my half cup measuring cup had shortening all over it. So I'm actually just gonna use my 1 cup measuring cup and just fill it up about halfway, okay? And mix those in, get those chocolate chips nice and coated in the flour mixture. And then the very last step, as far as mixing and ingredients goes, is our buttermilk. All right, now, in order to make sure that your scones stay kind of nice and light and airy, you really don't want to overmix. So what I'm doing right now is just kind of lightly blending these things in just to moisten the dry ingredients with the milk. Okay, so I'm really not adding a lot of pressure. I'm just kind of lightly coating all of the dry ingredients with the milk. And don't worry if there's like, you know, some dry bits at the bottom of the pan. It's really, or of the mixing bowl. It's not that big of a deal. All right, so I kind of have this formed up into like a little ball in the side of the bowl. And now I'm going to prepare my surface so that I can roll these out and cut them into scones. How I like to do this is get a little bit of water on a paper towel. So just get a paper towel just damp, not wet, but just damp. And then I like to take a little pinch of flour and kind of sprinkle that on there. And this is what I call creating a canvas. You know how a canvas feels? It's kind of rough. What it's going to do is just make it so that this sticky dough doesn't stick to the counter. Okay, so all of that comes out, and really all we're doing, we're not over handling it because then it's going to get tough. We're just kneading it about, 6 to 8 times to make sure it all sticks together and it's not crumbly. And as soon as it's all sticking together and you don't have pieces coming off, you can start flattening it out into your circle. And you don't need to get out the ruler or anything like that, but you can press it down into, just estimate what's about a 1/2 inch. Okay, so 1/2 inch tall from your counter to the top of the scones, or the top of the dough. All right, so depending on what you're cutting on, you want something sharp but not super sharp. So I like to use, this is called a bench scraper, and I'll show you that a little bit more as my videos go on. But I like to cut it in 8 equal parts, okay? Not 4, not 6, not 10, not 12. The recipe, time, and temperature is for 8 scones. And that's because of their size, and just making sure that they all cook uniformly together, okay? So, what would happen if you cut them into 12ths and you use the same temp and the same time? What would happen if you cut them into 4ths and you used the same temp and the same time? Okay, so those are things, I would love for you to think about. All right, so I've got them all arranged on my ungreased baking sheet. Okay, and my oven is preheated. So I'm gonna go ahead and put these in the oven. And your oven rack should be somewhere around the middle of the oven, just so it cooks nice and evenly, okay? And then timer is gonna get going. It says 8 to 10 minutes. Whenever there's a range, I always start on the low end because you can always add more, but you can't take it away if you've added too much. All right, so 8 minutes was perfect. They look nice and golden brown. Now all I'm gonna do is take them off of the baking sheet so that they don't get soggy on the bottom from the condensation, and put them onto a cooling rack. If you don't have a cooling rack, it's not a big deal. You can put them right onto plates, but I do like to use the cooling rack. All right, there's our scones.